Good morning. My name is Fernando Hernández. I'm a senior risk consultant for Palisade Corporation, and I will be presenting during the next hour a case using decision tool suites, precision tree, and at risk in order to build a decision tree and respectively a Monte Carlo simulation analysis in order to do some case on the development for decision-making models for the drug development industry. There's an article that I published a year ago, which is being posted here on my LinkedIn article page. I've already posted here on the chat its reference, so you can refer to it. It's actually going to be making reference to exactly the same case, and you can always browse it as long as we can see the model itself eventually. If any one of you is interested on us sending you the case, the Excel files, we will provide them by the end of our presentation. So you'll have availability to have and work the model out with those two tools on top. And the tools I'm talking here about are on top of Excel, two tools, as I've mentioned, decision tools, suites tools. One is at risk, which is our major Monte Carlo simulation tool, which, as you can see now, is being loaded on top of Excel. That is the very nature of all our tools that we deliver, which are tools that are going to be placed themselves, as you can see here, on top of Excel. So that's one tool that I already have over here, at risk on top of Excel, which is going to allow us to do Monte Carlo simulation. The second tool, it's going to be precision tree, which, as you can see over here, is going to be also loaded on top of our Excel worksheet in order to work our model out. Two ribbons, one for at risk, one for precision tree, have already been loaded on top of your Excel worksheet. Evidently, I already have a model ready for you to see. This is a model in which we work out a discounted cash flow analysis for a specific drug research project. It contains the basic projects or the basic elements of any one of these projects. The very nature of the industry is essentially a step-by-step industry. Evidently, we are making some gross simplifications. This is a 10-year project, as you can see over here, on which the first 5 years are going to be successive steps in which we either scale up the project, then go through clinical trials 1, clinical trials 2, FDA approval, and finally on year 5, we launch our project. 5 years, starting on year 6 to 10, are going to simply be our sales. So as you can see, our cash flow over here stands with sales starting on year 5, because for the first 5 years, the company is essentially only investing on R&D and on administrative expenses. Now, the referral to the construction of this simplified version of our model comes back from parameters. So for example, there's going to be some assumptions with respect to the size of this evaluation model. There's going to be some information on the peak market size, the administrative expenses per year, the reference price per unit we are going to sell the product for. There's some additional information on the royalties being paid for the licensing agreement of the research project. There's some information also on how to incorporate variation on R&D expenses along time, the discount rate for the discounted cash flow analysis, and very, very importantly, the probabilistic factors we're going to be using in order to achieve each one of the 4 stages that we have in our project. The whole project hinges essentially on these probabilities. In other words, what we're saying over here is that there's only a 70% chance of success of scaling up the project on year 2 if we were to be successful on its stage development. Then, conditional to this 70%, there's going to be a 40% probability of succeeding on clinical trials 1, 60% on clinical trials 2, and finally there's a 90% probability that contingent on the success on previous stages, we might eventually make it to the market. And if we make it to the market on these years, these are going to be the market penetration rates with respect to the peak market size that we have here on top. In other words, this is going to be from year 5 to 10, the rate of growth of our market. And as you can see over here, these are going to be the cumulative probabilities, 70%. But then for clinical trials 2, this is only 28% because it is the previous probability, 70 times its respective probability of 40%. That is going to be 28%. At the end of the day, what we're saying over here is that cumulatively, there's 15% probability that this is going to be a successful project. In other words, only 1 out of 7 approximately projects of this nature are going to be successful. Well, if we were to construct this model naively using just an NPV, the NPV would be wrong. And it is wrong because we are using the assumption that we're going to make it into the market. And as you can see, there's only a 15% chance of going into the market. That's why we don't use the standard traditional analysis framework, which we call discounted cash flow, because we are not considering, as you can see over here, the probabilities of being successful on each one of these stages on our project. That is why we use risk-adjusted or expected NPV, which is the standard tool in the industry. So instead of working an NPV, which is going to discount over here your revenues minus your expenses, we bring them back here to present value using the 10% discount rate in order to obtain NPV. We don't use this one. We use something which is either called expected NPV or risk-adjusted NPV. And it's very simple. Instead of working on our revenues for EBITDA over here, plain as they are, we multiply our EBITDAs, in other words, our cash flows, times the probabilities, or we call them risk factors, of being successful on each one of the stages. Therefore, for example, for probability on year 1, instead of considering at EBITDA, which is negative at 2,300, we do multiply that times 70%. In other words, there's only a 70% chance that we might eventually have this cash flow over here. Next year, clinical trials 1, that is year 2, we only have a cumulative 28% chance of having such an expenditure and a revenue. Therefore, our discounted, shaved off, expected or risk-adjusted NPV or cash flow for that period is going to be this one. So this is what we discount. And at the end of the day, when we discount them at the same expected rate of 10%, we come up with an expected NPV of approximately $5 million. This is risk-adjusted or expected NPV. This is the standard tool in the industry. What we are going to try to demonstrate over here is that this expected NPV is a very naive representation of actual risk, because that particular cash flow is never going to happen. 6 times out of 7 approximately, that is in approximately 85% of the cases, you won't make any money. As a matter of fact, you lose a lot of money out of spending money on R&D and admin expenses along the pathway of any one of these years, all the way up to the point at which you're successful or relatively successful up to that stage. You want to make it to year 5 successfully. If you make it up to year 5, then you'll be able to be better off and eventually launch these sales starting on that year. So how do we do this? Well, we go and work a different representation of risk. So remember this amount of money, expected NPV of approximately $5 million. That is going to be our reference point. Let me just add another representation of what we've had so far. So for example, on this model over here, in which we've already added, by the way, using precision tree, a tree, which we will later see. Let me just go, before seeing the tree, to the model itself. So here's the model. This is our NPV, which we discard. We never use this one. This is our expected NPV, which is approximately 5 million. And what we want to incorporate here is what we would call a probabilistic EBITDA. In other words, some EBITDA that is going to be contingent on whether we attain our figures and are successful on each one of these stages over here. So at this point, let me start working on something a little bit more enhanced, which I call here the final version. Let us go over here to model and see how is it shaped. Now we've got approximately our 48 million. This changes, and you'll see in a minute why it changes. I am F9ing. That's why you're getting different results over here on NPV. You're getting slightly different results also always as every single F9, that is recalculation on my expected NPV, and same thing is happening here with the probabilistic NPV. So let me go back to the basics of Monte Carlo simulation being managed here by at risk to show a couple of things. We said first on parameters, for example, the sum of these variables for our model are probabilistic. For example, at some point we said that the royalty percentage, about $10 million, was going to be this amount of money. But for example, R&D expenses is going to have a variation of 10%. In other words, we are not sure whether R&D is going to be held constant along the fixed number of years in which we have R&D expenditures. So how does this impact, for example, the creation of our model? If I were to go here to, for example, R&D, take a look that the R&D row here has numbers that at every single F9, that is recalculation of my model, I'm obtaining different figures. And these figures stem from the fact that I'm already using a normal distribution function over here. I mean, in other words, a normal distribution function being provided courtesy of at risk has let me define R&D based on a single mean value, which is $750 plus minus a standard deviation or variation of $75. Therefore, it's 10%. In other words, every single time I hit F9, at risk on top of Excel is going to randomly generate what we call an iteration, that is a sampled value, a sample figure that is being randomly generated out of those figures. So for example, on any given year, that amount, 795, can change to different numbers. Pay attention, for example, on cell B14. It does contain a certain variation at this point. Same thing is happening for each one of the figures over here, which have a different random normal functions having been previously defined for their R&D variation. That's why we're not getting necessarily a fixed R&D for each one of our years in which we have that expenditure. Same thing happens with admin expenses. This is a little bit simpler. For example, as you can see here, PERT is another distribution function which allows you to define a certain distribution with a certain minimum, a certain maximum, and a certain most likely or modal value in the center. Those three parameters, as you can see, have already been previously defined as references to cells coming from B, C, and D3 on parameters. In other words, some expert over here concluded that, for example, on row 3, the variation of admin expenses was going to be with a minimum of 280, a most likely of 300, and a max of 320. So for every single year that we have admin expenses over here, we're going to be generating random values with the PERT distribution functions on top. By the way, at this point, I'd be able to, with the model window button, see all the cells in my model that at this point there's 32 cells that already carry a distribution function. In other words, they are being considered not necessarily deterministically or fixed, but they are considered as a distribution curve on each one of them. So I've got my admin expenses over here. I've got market penetrations as well. They already carry another risk representation. We are obviously not sure of our market penetration. As you can see, for example, the pathway, once we're on year 5, can change over here. So this is, for example, 220, 28, 57, so on and so forth. But the next run, it's going to be slightly different and slightly different and slightly different. So in other words, our market penetration does become also one of, let's put it this way, moving part of your model. As a matter of fact, there's a way in which I'd be able to, at this point, out of utilities, I could color those cells that already contain a moving part that is one cell that changes along with your colors. And I could either be able to specify here some of the moving grounds. For some reason, I'm not being able to see them well. In any case, take a look at, for example, here what happens with your expected NPV, how it changes. Now, the most important thing that we could, at this point, define as a distribution function is evidently these cells here. The whole model hinges upon the conditional success at each one of these 4 stages. On the scaling up, CT1, CT2, and then finally FDA approval with those respective probability functions or probabilities of success. So take a look at, for example, at this particular cell, C7. C7 does contain, as you can see on its formula, a conditional B7, which in this case is the previous one. So anything multiplied times 1 is already 1, times a Bernoulli. A Bernoulli is a binary distribution. It's a distribution that only allows for 2 states of nature. It's either a 0, that is failure, non-success, which in this case it's 30%, or 1, 70% probability of achieving a 1. In other words, every single time during a simulation is going to be run, 70% of the cases I may eventually run into a 1, and on 30% of the cases I may eventually run into a 0. So in other words, let me F9, that is recalculate cells, and see what happens on top of cell C7. Every now and then, as a matter of fact, if I were to do this many, many times over, on 70% of the cases, you'd come up with a 1. Now, if there's a 1 over here on scaling up, then clinical trials 1, the next stage, is going to be contingent on the previous one, which, as you can see, this C7, its previous success, it's either a 1 or a 0 in case of failure, times its respective Bernoulli. Now, the probability of this clinical trials 1 being successful in this case is cumulatively, at this point, your 28%. That is why, for example, at this particular stage, you'd be able to see, for example, that there is a 60% probability of non-success, failure, and then there's going to be a 40% probability of success on 1. So it's either a distribution function that only allows for 0s and 1s. What is it that I am betting on this model? Let me just F9 this many times over and see what happens. What I'm betting here is that my project is going to be a successful one. That once I can overcome FDA approval, I get 1s all the way up to here. By the way, starting on cell G7 on your 5th year, this is just a continuation of the previous failure or success, in this case a 1 that you've got. So let me F9 several times. For example, this point, you made it all the way successfully to scaling up, and then you failed. But then on the next one, for example, over here, oops, we made it all the way here. We got a 1, a 1, a 1, a 1. Finally, I mean, the probability of having 4 consecutive or 5 consecutive 1s over here, provided that on year 1 you're already making success and you're deciding on the project, so there's 5 of them. The probability of having 5 consecutive ones over here is actually 15%. It's the cumulative theoretical risk probability that we're carrying over here on this cell. So in other words, on only 15% of the cases, if I were to have 9 many times over, I would eventually run into such a successful cash flow. And see what happens with my cash flow in this instance. It becomes absolutely positive. 52 million or 52,000, it's going to be my probabilistic NPV because I can obviously make it all the way to the end. Sadly, this is not going to be the case all the time because if I were to have 9 to the next iteration, that is for the next trial of iterations on my distribution functions, this number becomes a negative one. Because as you can see over here, I only made it here to stage number 1. In this one, I didn't even make it to be successful on stage number 1. So I lost that amount of money. This is another semi-happy ending. You went all the way, went successful on 1, on 2, but then failed on clinical trials 2. So on and so forth. As a matter of fact, if you think it over, the worst thing that could happen is that you were to go successful up to here, and then all of a sudden up to here, and I would have to look it up over here many times over, I would make it all the way to here and then a successive zeros because you've already paid R&D expenses up to here, admin expenses up to here, and then all of a sudden you're suddenly not successful here. So in other words, the cell probabilistic NPV as opposed to my expected NPV or risk-adjusted NPV is a more realistic representation of your risk over here. It is going to allow you to eventually see what happens. Now, at this point, I am going to generate some 5,000 iterations on that cell. In other words, since it has already been declared an output, and once again, I am F9 in here, I am manually recalculating here my cells one by one, I may be able then to change them and eventually see what happens on top of that cell. Well, that process, that manual simulation is going to happen here automatically when I start my simulation. By the way, notice that I've turned on my demo mode here. Demo mode would allow me to see the interactive simulation during the 5,000 iterations run. Now I start my simulation. See what happens when I start my simulation. The software over here, having been placed on top of that cell, is going to generate this number of values. Let me just pause it over here for you to see what happens during the simulation run. See what happens with my probabilistic NPV. Now at this point, as you can see, 2 basic mounts are starting to be built over here. Let me pause it just to move this on top of 0 and keep it running. Now see what happens over here. Approximately 85% of the time, I am getting a negative outcome over here. I'm not making money. And approximately, as you can see here, 15% of the time, let me pause it for you to see approximately here, approximately 15% of the time, you're making a lot of money. On average, you have something here in the middle, which deterministically, traditionally has been called expected or risk-adjusted NPV, which is an unrealistic amount here in the center, which approximately will end up around $5 million or 5,000 around here. Obviously, I don't want to spend here my next 10 minutes on the process. I can always speed the process up by turning off my updating chart feature. So now you can see that this is running a tad faster, and that is because I'm not updating here dynamically my probabilistic NPV chart. I can also turn off my updating Excel feature by clicking in this button. So as you can see here, the simulation is running much faster. So these 2 buttons, you can turn them on or off anytime during the simulation run. As you can see here, now the chart is the only one that is going to be updated. But then let me turn those 2 features off in order to run my simulation much faster, in this case 5,000 iterations, and be able to run my simulation at this point. Now, if you were to go here all the way to the end, you'd be able then to see what is going to happen after 5,000 iterations. So you come over here, 5,000 iterations, and now after 5,000 iterations, let me open my probabilistic NPV and see its results. As I stated before, during the passes I've made to the chart, as you can see, there's approximately 85% of the cases were negative, and approximately 15% of the cases were heftily positive. On average, you're making something around the 5,000, which is right here in the center. That is your expected or risk-adjusted NPV. Now, a better zoom in detail can be performed on top of this negative size. Let me change this to relative frequency or to probability density for you to see that there's a slight difference here on the way in which we chart this out. But what I want to do over here is just to focus on the negative outcomes over here. This 85% of the outcomes that I have over here. This is important. So let me define a filter. A filter over here lets me only see, as the filter in Excel works, some specific iterations out of the 5,000. So what I'm going to tell the filter over here is just take a look on those numbers that were generated between minus infinity all the way up to 0. In other words, I am only going to focus on the negative outcomes of my chart. See what happens. I am only seeing now my negative outcomes. For some reason, the previous chart doesn't make a difference between negative numbers. This is just a chart or graphic limitation on the software. But then if I were to filter, I'd be able to see that it's essentially composed of 4 different mounts. And yes, these mounts that I now have over here are going to account for the different probable outcomes in which I'd go. For example, I told you about the worst outcome. The worst outcome would have been to go all the way to scale up, number 1, number 2, clinical trials 1, number 3, clinical trials 3, and then eventually to scale up. Imagine to go FDA approval. Imagine that you went all the way for 4 years spending money and couldn't make it to FDA approval. So approximately around here, that particular scenario would happen on approximately 2.2% of the time, in which you would lose approximately 6,000 around here. Now, by using these delimiters around here, you'd be able to somehow state the nature of these mounts. For example, the next mount goes around 4,700. There's approximately 13% probability that you'd lose money all the way up to failure on clinical trials 2. Then failure on all the way up to clinical trials 1. As you can see, this is a very likely scenario. 50% of the failing scenarios over here would happen right after clinical trials 1. And then 35% of the cases that you'd see over here would be able to be the cases, the negative ones, in which you were not successful on this very first stage that you had. In other words, we are seeing a better detailed representation of our negative possible outcomes when we see this over here. Let me just restore the filter that I had in order to see the whole thing over once again around 40,000 over here and then around 0. In other words, I've created a model over here which can then be compared to something else. For example, as you can see, expected NPV by itself, the previous deterministic one, could have been shown as in here. There's not too much variation in expected NPV, and that is because all the variation stems out of R&D expenditures, admin expenditures, market penetration, variation rates, things of that nature. So as you can see, the variation only goes from 4.2 to 6.2 mil over here. This is unreal because as we can see over here, this is just the expected NPV. In reality, the project itself could go as negative as $6 million and as positive as more than 50,000 on the other side. In other words, I can always compare those two. I could come over here to summary, and, for example, take expected NPV over here, drag it out from here, and then for comparison purposes, go back to summary and compare your probabilistic NPV on top of those ones. And this is what you can show. Yes, expected NPV right here in the center only naively shows what happens around here. But then this is not reality. Reality is either here or here. You either make a lot of money in 15% of the cases or lose some money on 85% of the cases. That is the very nature of the industry. Now, this representation in which we're seeing conditional success over here or conditional failure over here can also be shown, not necessarily obviously built, but not necessarily only, this is the only way, as a decision tree. In other words, not only have I constructed here a structure to using the Bernoulli's branch into conditional risks that go beyond next stages, but this whole thing can also be viewed as a tree. So if I were to go to a tree that has previously been built with precision tree, which is the other tool parallel to at risk that allows us to build these trees, see what happens on this tree. Trees, for example, such as this one, allows you to interact with decisions such as these green squares over here and chances or probabilities, which are these red circular nodes. In other words, you make a decision here up front, and the decision is whether to invest or not. As you can see, the tree which has already been solved already stems out with a true over here. Because in this particular representation, the tree is actually prescribing you the idea that it is a good thing to eventually make it all the way to the end. Now, as you can see over here, this particular iteration or representation of risk is already being matched by the fact that I'm already successful on each one of the stages. Now remember, this only happens on 15% of the cases. I'm making this upfront amount of money. But then see what happens on the next stage. Let me F9. For example, in this one, I didn't even make it to scale up stage over here. See what's happened with the tree. The tree in this case has become a false on yes. In other words, do not proceed to your drug investment endeavor. Because as you can see over here, there is the likelihood of going forward on each one of the stages, provided that there's a 70, there's a 40, there's a 60, and then finally there's a 90% cumulative probability on each one of the first, on the next 4 stages, is going to eventually end up here, going through any one of these failure stages at any given point. In other words, I've created here, as you can see, a probabilistic tree. You see the numbers changing because I'm manually recalculating, I'm manually hitting on my F9 recalculation button in Excel in order to create every now and then each one of the stages that I have over here. Let me try to match it and make it a true one on investment, such as this one. For example, in this one, I am making all the way to the end 48,717. That is exactly what's being matched over here. And that is because I made it on each one of my stages over here. Now, as you can see, these blue numbers that I have over here at the end of each one of the branches are going to be calculated. This is the virtue of the software, to calculate these probabilities and expected ending values, these blue values and probabilities at the end of each one of these branches as a model. I've taken all these blue numbers at the end of my branches and summarized them on my model feature right around, where are they? Here. No, I don't have them. I don't have them over here. Oops. I did make a change. Let me just unload. For some reason I erase my probabilistic NPV. Let me just load this again. I haven't changed anything on the model. The only thing that I missed was the simulation. But once again, see what happens with my simulation here when I F9 upon the results that I have over here. Okay, what I want to show over here is that you can show the pathway here of your model. As you can see, successfully all the way to the end. This is what you want. This is what you desire, to have 48,000 over here because you were successful on each one of the stages all the way to the end. That doesn't happen all the time. So what I want to do here next, once I've overcome my model so far, in which I have one particular project, is to be able to construct a portfolio of many of these projects. Now, let me once again simulate 5,000 iterations. Let me not turn on my demo mode here in order for the software to run the simulation faster. At-risk is smart enough in this case not to, as you can see, generate a graph and change the values iteratively of the Excel model, and it is going to rather simulate a little bit faster. And as you can see here, by the end of some 40 seconds is going to be able to generate 5,000 what we call iterations. In other words, 5,000 representations of however each one of your output variables is going to look like. So by the end of the 5,000 iterations, once again, this is the way my probabilistic NPV looks like. And remember, this whole negative side is already composed of 4 different amounts. Now, I can take that information and try to build what I've called over here a synthetic distribution function. Approximately from results for your expected NPV from minus 2,900 to minus 2,600, I have already built that distribution function. This is one mound, this is another mound, this is another one, this is the next 4th one in which I barely make it to 0, and finally I have this one in which this is a positive one that I have over here with that amount of money over here. So I could create synthetic distribution functions that after any number of distribution functions would be able to generate random numbers over here, which I've already generated on a previous case. As you can see, I've got 1,000 cases over here. And I'd be able to, for example, using my fitting distribution function, I'd be able to show as something such as this. Once again, what I'm trying to show here are all the negative outcomes and all the positive outcomes that I have over here. Why is it that I want that? Well, I want to create synthetic distribution functions that would look at a way in which most of the time I'd be able to construct a synthetic distribution function out of here. In other words, approximately 1% of the cases, I would have something from here to here. On approximately 10% of the cases, I would have something from here to here, and so on and so forth. By that way, by having some frequencies for each one of these ranges, I may be able to synthetically construct the shape of that distribution function that I show for this particular project. Now, let us go to the next stage. Provided that this has already been cleared, let me jump over to the following stage, in which what I want to do over here is jump into a portfolio of projects. So in other words, let me just get out of here and let me build a portfolio in which I already have some 20 of those projects. So for example, project number 1 is a project that requires 17,000 out of upfront investment, but then it generates, as you can see here, 5 different mounts. 4 of them are negative, such as this one, and then finally the 5th one is a positive one. In other words, I am building here, and just by turning off my updating Excel feature, let us focus just on project number 1. See that these numbers are changing. And these numbers, as you can see, there's already a distribution function for each one of these mounts. For example, the first mount over here looks like this one with a defined distribution function. In other words, I may lose money all the way up to here, all the way up to here. These are negative numbers with a certain probability. In other words, for this particular project, there's a approximately 2% probability that this first mount would happen. There's a 10.7 probability that this mount would happen. There's a 42% probability that this will happen, 30% that this will happen, and then finally, approximately 15% of the time that you'd make a lot of money on this particular mount. The beta general distribution function, and once again, I'm assuming that I've already have the particular synthetically corrected or synthetically created distribution functions for each one of these is going to look like this. So if at this point I were to, and let me do this rather fast, only simulate, say, 1,000 iterations to make it a little bit faster over here. If I were to, for example, at this particular output, generate a simulation, this is the way this particular project, project number 1, would look like. Let me place myself on the simulated NPV, which is, as you can see, an output of this particular project. And, well, this project, it's because this is not executed. So let me do this again. Let me execute, quote unquote, each one of my projects. So now I can see that cell on column U, which, as you can see, has already been declared as an output. There's the necessity of declaring the cells that you want to use on your model as an output. So let me just now here resimulate here 1,000 iterations. In other words, column U is going to be the summary of 5 different mounts or distribution functions with these respective probabilities. So my cell should now look something like that. So this is project 1. Project 2 looks like this one. Project 3 looks like this one. Remember, we are getting away from the idea of expected or risk-adjusted NPV. We are seeing each one of our projects, in this case, for example, project 9, as projects with either negative numbers or positive numbers. And that's the way in which we're seeing the very nature of each one of the projects. Now, if at this point I had enough money on my portfolio to execute the 20 investments, and by that I have already placed a 1, that is an execution on my V column, I may be able to now simulate for cell NPV. I've already done that. I've already simulated 1,000 iterations of a portfolio in which I execute my 20 different projects. And this is the way my portfolio NPV would at this point look like. So when I summarize some negative numbers and some other positive numbers, as you can see over here so far, now this is a 50-50 portfolio. In other words, there's a 50% chance, not 85% chance of losing money, and there's a 50% chance approximately of making money. Now, on average, you're making this amount of money. This would be the expected or risk-adjusted NPV for your portfolio projects. Now, this is the beauty of diversification. That's the reason why we diversify. We diversify because now we reduce our risk, in this case from 85% of individually generated projects to only 50%. Now, this is provided courtesy of the fact, in this case, that all the projects are correlated between each other with a 50% correlation coefficient. Remember, correlations stand to be actually the factor in which we consider, as you can see here, whether these outcomes of each one of the clusters, as you can see here, have been correlated. As you can see, when I generate this discrete distribution functions, once again, let me place myself, for example, on top of this cell, you'd be able to take a look at my 5 different outcomes possible courtesy of the discrete function. So those are my 5 possible outcomes, either among 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. 5 is the one in which I make a lot of money, and that's its likelihood, 15.7%. Now, as you can see, by F9ing many times over, I'm getting on column SS which one of these outcomes is being possible. Now, this is what I want to point out, a reference to CorrelMat. CorrelMat, it's actually a correlation between the projects. If correlation, and I've already placed correlation here, were to be placed not at 50% or 0.5 correlation coefficient, but rather at 0, in other words, 0 means that there's no correlation whatsoever between neither one of the projects, and I were to now simulate 1,000 iterations. Now remember, this is my NPV with a correlation coefficient of 50 or 0.50. Let me now simulate, assuming that I have perfectly independent projects. 20 different projects are totally independent from one to another. That has already been laid out by the fact that there's no correlation, or correlation coefficient is 0. Take a look at the simulated NPV. Oh, this is a beauty. I've reduced my risk from 50%, well, actually originally from 85% to 50%, and now to 26%. The mean remains the same. This is the mean portfolio expectation. It's the same, but then I've reduced my risk. And this is the non-diversifiable risk when I have perfect absolute independency of my variables. What I would also ask, what would be if I were to have a really, really high correlation coefficient between projects, for example, at 0.95? In other words, I mean, you can see the whole table being filled in here with 0.95s, and obviously I'm making a very simplifying implication here or assumption, and that is that the correlation coefficient between each one of the projects is remaining the same correlation coefficient. Let me simulate here on highly dependent projects one to another. In other words, we're investing on 20 projects of the same type of treatment or drug, in which after simulation, this will look something like this. As you can see now, I'm not diversifying risk. Now there's a 70% chance that I won't make any money. There's only a 28% chance that you'll make money. On average, once again, the power is that the mean remains the same. It is the risk that changes radically depending, once again, on your correlation coefficients. So assuming, for example, that there's in total independence between your projects, that is on 0, the next question is, given constraints on your budget, in other words, I don't have enough money to invest, let's put it this way, on all my projects. Let me just randomly here execute this on these projects. Placing a 0 over here means that the project is not being executed, and only, in this case, 13 projects are going to be executed. The required amount for that, as you can see, has been decreased to 110. Okay, and I could still decrease this, for example, to less than 100,000, for example, in this case. This combination, for example, of 12 different projects, the combination of project number 1, project number 3, project number 6, so on and so forth, is going to give me an investment which is slightly less than, say, my budget of 100,000, but then is going to produce this simulated NPV. The next natural question is an optimization question. What is the combination of projects that I shall execute over here in order to make it that I maximize the simulated NPV of my portfolio, and at the same time, I make it to my budget on $100,000? Well, that can be solved using the definition of an optimization problem, which merges optimization technology and simulation technology on the same side. So as you can see, I've already laid out here this one, in which I want to maximize the mean of NPV. NPV, as we've already pointed out, is cell U3. The adjustable cells, that is, in other words, the cells you want to solve for are either integer numbers between zeros and ones, in other words, only zeros and ones, on the range V4, V23, combinations of zeros and ones, that make it under two constraints. And the two constraints are essentially that I have a maximum investment, as you can see here. Let me edit that cell, in which W3 can never be larger than your maximum investment, nor can it be less than your minimum investment. Now, maximum investment and minimum investment can be placed over here. In other words, this is my max limit. I may invest all the way up to $100,000. So let me start with a really lousy starting point. In other words, let me start with a point in which I am only investing on one single project, whatever that is. I'm only investing $4,100 on project number 8. At this point, in order to make it much faster, let me only use 100 iterations per simulation. And let me, at this point, start my optimization process. Now, at this point, the process or the software using what's called genetic algorithms, which is a methodology for optimization, is going to start testing at first with optimization points. As you can see, it's testing for zeros and ones. That's why we are having this chart, which looks like a checkerboard, in which we see zeros standing for the black slots and ones as the white ones, in which the software is testing for different combinations that eventually enhance the pathway towards maximizing the mean of your simulated NPV. How do I see this? I see that in progress. See my progress pathway. I started with an NPV, with a mean NPV around here. As you can see it here, your original one was only 872. And now it has already climbed up all the way up to close to 19,000 over here after your trial 219. Now I can see all my trials. Let me stretch my watcher window over here for you to see all the trials that have been tested over here. Every now and then, for example, you'd see that there are none available or error created lines. And that is because the software is either not complying any one of the two constraints that I have. I could only focus on those, on all the trials, or I could focus on only those trials that eventually make it better than the previous ones. For example, at this point, my best trial has been my 288th one, in which after 1 minute 15, 100 iterations per trial have been tested on my portfolio creation. And so far, this is my best mean NPV with a certain minimum and maximum with a certain combinations of ones and zeros. I could see it also as a population. In other words, I've got here each one of my adjustable cells or columns, and I could see the composition of all the way up to 50 tests. Why 50? Because the software in this case by default is using 50 random trials to start with for each one of my outputs. So far, as you can see, the software has already become steady on its combinations of ones and zeros. In other words, it has already flatlined on the other side. The software is at this point not able to achieve a better solution to what I have so far, and it has steadied itself at such a solution. So this is probably a good point for me to stop it, come back here and stop my optimization, and I've already got a clue. So if I were to close this one over here, I'd be able to see then this is where it's telling me, you know, do invest as much as on those 15 projects, that combination. In other words, do not invest on project number 10 and on these projects over here, starting from 15 to 18, as much as close to $100,000, and this would maximize your NPV, which after those number of trials would eventually give you this curve for your NPV. You can still lose money. Yes, there's a 28% chance that you lose money. There's a 72% chance that you'll make money. On average, this is going to be approximately $20,000 out of out of actual simulated NPV. Now, this is provided once again on the fact that we have no correlation. If we were to have, let's say, an intermediate correlation of 0.50, then probably our outcomes would be rather different. And once again, let me start from scratch at any given point over here in which the correlation coefficients have been laid out differently. Let me start my simulation, my optimization again, and see if I may eventually get a different output. Now, one simplification, let me insist on this, I've already mentioned that, but one simplification here is that the correlation coefficient between each one of the projects to all of the rest of them is the same, in this case 50%. That is obviously not necessarily the case. You can always manually, and you should always manually, construct correlation matrices for each one of the combinations of all your stages over here. So in other words, in this case, I'd be able to start building, take a look at how my diversity looks like at this point so far, on which the software is, as you can see, optimizing here positions in order to eventually achieve the best answer. The fact of the matter that you see that some of these columns, and there's one column for each one of your adjustable cells, is becoming eventually of the same color, actually is telling you the story that the software has already converged to a unified solution for each one of them. As you can see, this takes a while. You'll never know when to stop it. As a matter of fact, that is one of the, let's put it, rather inconveniences or relative weaknesses of these genetic algorithm processes, in which you don't necessarily know what's going to be the end of your process in order to stop it. There's one clue over here, which is the homogenization of your colors. The other clue is the flat line you've got over here on your progress. When you see that it happens, you go through some time over here, the software won't be able to scale up or down with respect to the flat line that has already been created. And in this case, for example, as you can see, the solution is not necessarily 19,900 as we were achieving before. In this case, it's a rather smaller one at 18,500. Let me stop it here. So I stop my optimization process. I skip this part as well over here. And as you can see, the combination of 15 projects is slightly different over here. So those are the projects that should be avoided in this case when given your combination of your correlation coefficient of 0.50 between your projects. At this point, since the simulation has been performed, let me increase a little bit the convergence, that is the precision of my model. Let me at least generate 1,000 iterations in order to soften out and create a much smoother curve on my expected NPV. If I were to take a look at my NPV at this point, it would certainly look like that. So I've shaved off my probabilities of a negative outcome to 48%. So this is tossing a coin with a certain slant to winning money, provided that there's a rather intermediate correlation between projects. And as you can see, the mean remains approximately at 20,000, but then this is the amount of money that you would eventually make it. Some additional interpretations, you could also start answering questions like, for example, what is the probability of, say, making more than 100,000 on NPV? You can always answer that question. There's a 9.3% probability of making this amount of money. There's, on the other hand, as we've already pointed out, a 48% probability of not making money, of losing money over here. And then there's a 43% probability of making as much as this money. Now, the other way to put it is to place a, for example, a confidence interval, let's say at 80%. So you want to leave 20% on your left-hand side tail, and this would be your VAR, your value at risk, at 80% confidence. You are 80% confident that you might lose on this portfolio as much as $23,000, which is another way to put it. Instead of having, for example, on our optimization, expected to maximize the mean NPV, it's perfectly logic in this case also to say maximize out of your NPV, for example, a certain percentile. So in this case, you want to, for example, maximize your 20th percentile. This is a way in which you limit the tails of the distribution and not necessarily focus on the center, the mean of your distribution. So by the end of this presentation, we're already at the end of it. I wanted to present, as you can see, two different stages. One stage, which is the single individual framework for working probabilistic NPVs as opposed to expected NPVs or risk-adjusted NPVs as another framework for these types of models. And second of all, I wanted to show you the risk optimization framework that we had over here. As I stated here before, the contents of what I've shown today, I've already posted that as an article on my LinkedIn page, which in this moment I am sending you as a link on the chat of this webinar for you to access and for you to friend me on my LinkedIn if you wanted to. This has been our presentation for the day. I appreciate you, all of you who have attended to the presentation, and we'll make it available for you on the following days with the project, with the models in Excel for you to take a look at it and view it. Thank you very much for your attendance. I hope you have a great weekend wherever you are. Bye-bye.